Well, it's actually a really, really tough act to follow after Vanguard, so I'm not sure we're going to be as exciting, but I wanted to welcome everyone. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Dahlia Mihyar. I'll be the moderator today for this topic that's reshaping global operations and leadership at every level, the new reality of crisis leadership. We are living in a time when disruptions are faster, broader, and more complex than ever. We have a lot of geopolitical shifts that are happening, from cyber attacks to climate disasters and, of course, pandemics. The ability to respond with intelligence, speed, and coordination is no longer a luxury, but it's also a necessity. I'm honored to be joined by this incredible mix of leaders that we have today. They have deep expertise in crisis and also in high-stakes environment. So let me go ahead by introducing this amazing panel. So I will start with Aimee. We have Aimee Pearce-Kaul, who leads global crisis management and physical security at ByteDance. Aimee is an accomplished security and crisis leader with deep expertise in intelligence operations and counterterrorism from her career in government agencies. She now drives global crisis strategy for industry-leading financial and tech firms, managing risk for more than 150 countries. We also have Giles Hill, Group Head of Global Security Services at International SOS. Giles was a 3-star general in the British Army who led high readiness forces in multiple crises around the world for over 3 decades. He also served inside the UK's cross-government National Security Crisis Management Organization. Giles now sits on the board of International SOS and leads the global security teams who provide intelligence, security assistance, and crisis management support to clients in over 100 countries. We also have the supervisory special agent, Nicolas Keefe. Nick is the U.S. mission to the United Arab Emirates and serves as the senior regional security officer at the U.S. Embassy in Abu Dhabi, promoting the safe and secure conduct of U.S. foreign policy. Prior to his assignment, he was a regional director for the Bureau of Diplomatic Security's High Threat Programs Directorate, overseeing the department's highest threat missions in Africa. Nick has over 20 years of U.S. government experience, including overseas tours in Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, Kosovo, Jerusalem, and Georgia. And last but not least, we have Nigel Lee. He is an independent risk advisor. Nigel has spent the last 20 years leading teams and companies in logistics and security sectors across the Middle East, West and North Africa. Multicultural integrations, conflict, post-conflict, and low infrastructure environment have added all to his deep understanding of risk and crisis leadership. So I wanted to thank all of you for being here and for being part of this critical conversation. So let's dive into it. So with this one big question that we have right now, what are the non-negotiables of leading through crisis today? And are we evolving fast enough to keep up? Aimee, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I think for me, one of the critical non-negotiables in crisis leadership specifically is trust and transparency. I think we've moved from it being a soft skill, and it's actually now one of the core attributes of any leader trying to work their way through a crisis. When the crisis occurs, people aren't looking for all of the answers immediately. What they're actually looking for is honest leadership. And when we're not truthful and transparent, that creates an information vacuum that quite often gets filled with speculation, misinformation, and sometimes internal distrust. So I think it's okay to just communicate, this is what we know, this is what we're doing, and this is what we're working to find out. Because that cadence of communication really sets the tone and keeps people grounded and aligned. But we know that trust isn't built in the moment of crisis. It's something that we need to build way before the crisis occurs. And it's really how leaders show up in the quiet times. Are they capable? Are they committed? Are they prepared? So I think for me, that's the kind of like the things that are non-negotiable now as we move forward through crises. Speaking to whether we're prepared and evolving fast enough, I think we're doing a pretty good job. I think most of the sectors have learned some valuable lessons in terms of trust and transparency. And where you look at where we are currently compared to where we were maybe 5 years ago in terms of that transparency and openness, I think it paints a very different picture in crisis management.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also with this all changing environment, it's really testing a lot of the leaders out there to see if the right leaders are in place. So this is excellent. Thank you so much for sharing. Giles, what do you think about that?
So I'm very conscious about the knowledge and the experience in the room. I've got my own experiences, but I think if there was a common thread, we'd probably all reflect that dealing with crises is a kind of human phenomenon, notwithstanding the previous speaker on the screen, that humans create crises, and essentially the leadership challenge is to build an ecosystem that creates the conditions for humans to perform. And I think there are three, you call them non-negotiables, I call them kind of essential elements, whatever the crises. The first is leadership, whether it's yours or the act of leadership in picking the leaders, the right leaders. The second is building the culture that allows people to operate in uncertainty when they're conscious of the significant consequences, when there's time pressure, when there's just not enough of everything. And we can maybe touch on what that culture means in a second. And then the third is some kind of disciplined process, some kind of guide rails, not too much, but not too little. And I think those three essential elements that I've learned, that I kind of build my crises capability around: the right leadership, the right culture, and the right disciplined process. And I think if you get those right and flood it with trust, those things can operate at a competitive speed with the nature of the crises. The big problem with crises, right, it gets away from you. It's not often the crisis itself, it's this feeling of loss of control. And trust enables you to move quickly. Absent trust, you're always going to be moving slowly than the evolving problem. So I think they're the essential elements for me.
Yeah, amazing. Trust is a repeating theme, and I'm sure we're going to see that more and more with our conversation today. Nick, from your perspective, what can you add to that?
Add breaking down silos. It's a bit of a cliche. It's something that we run into a lot of problems with in government. And I harken back to what we in the State Department went through, almost 15 years ago, in terms of Benghazi, and that experience, and how we have evolved since then, and really our partnerships across the U.S. government to try to get all the different agencies, in particular the Department of Defense, on the same page as far as providing differing perspectives. Oftentimes that might challenge what might be a single point of view or a single group's point of view that is going through a crisis, and taking that step back as a leader to try to develop that understanding and share that perspective and ensure that you understand where others within not just your organization but other organizations are approaching that crisis, to be open to new ideas in terms of how to approach that problem set and how to deal with it. Incorporating some of those new processes, in a plan ahead of a crisis obviously is important, testing the system out. But it goes back to some of the trust and communication points that were mentioned earlier, but also building that beyond just your organization or your department or agency. Thanks.
Thank you. And Nigel?
I think for the sake of time, I'll focus purely on the evolution. Are we evolving fast enough? Yes, we absolutely are. But everybody in this room, I believe, is a leader in security and has been dealing with crises repetitively, probably for the last 4 or 5 years, if not for longer than that. So we're getting used to it. We are evolving quickly because of the amount of time we're spending managing them and dealing with it. The most important piece that stops our progression is really talking to other people in our companies and really clearly identifying, is what we are dealing with a crisis, or is it just a disruption? Because disruption should be day to day, and too many other people not involved in security, not involved in risk, something disrupts them and it's immediately a crisis.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. So Giles, going back to you really quick, with your decades of experience leading high readiness forces and advising at the highest levels of the government, and now supporting clients globally through international SOS, how has the nature of crisis leadership evolved? What do today's business leaders most often underestimate when it comes to preparing for and navigating high impact crises?
I think there's a lot of kind of consistency in what works in crises, the kind of evergreen human characteristics that worked, millennia ago and are still valid and relevant today. I'm not saying they're easy. They're easy to talk about. They're less easy to do. My own experience, when I've looked to a leader in a crisis, I've wanted to see and experience calmness. And if you know General David Petraeus, he used to have a picture on his wall called "Comfort in a Stampede." And that sense of being able to deal with turbulence, I think, is very important. That's one evergreen principle of leadership. The consistency of the leader's behavior. If you can be true to yourself, no bells and whistles, consistent before a crisis, then you need to transition those behaviors into a crisis. The last thing a crisis needs is a new leader, or a leader that is kind of changed behavior because of the circumstance. I think personal resilience, mental and physical, is evergreen. And I think just understanding yourself and how you perform in a crisis. So I think there's a lot of evergreen consistency, but I think the world is changing, and it's changing really quickly. I'm sure speakers later today will talk about the new normal. And I think as leaders, what we've got to accept and think a lot about is presiding and leading this journey, what I'd call a kind of a set of capabilities that enable you to operate in a much more dynamic and turbulent environment versus a slightly more stable. I mean, the world has never been stable, and to think there was stability in the rearview mirror is probably false, but I kind of preside over a journey from strategic rigidity, a kind of version 1.0, to what I call strategic agility, or a version 2.0. So the preceding context, we sought clarity, we now seek understanding. We sought reactive and pre-planned, kind of on-the-shelf stuff, we now seek proactivity, adaptability, and we want options, right? We sought efficiency, we now need effectiveness. We had just in time, we now need a bit more just in case. We had centralized and vertical, we now need clear intent and delegation. We had coercive control, we now need trust and delegation. We had a closed system, we now need a flat and faster system. We had low comms where we husbanded information because it was powerful. We now need collaboration and the ability to share information. And by the way, if the leader isn't flat and fast in communication, then the organization certainly isn't going to be. So we want to move to lead the journey from a kind of system that induces high stress to a system that enables low stress and lots of trust. That isn't easy. It's tough to do. I've got huge faith in kind of human agency, but it does require, coming back to that word, a lot of trust and a lot of willingness to delegate. It needs the ability to back people up when things go wrong. And it needs that capacity to trust, which I think we'll constantly come back to. So that's a kind of the leadership presiding over that journey, given the world we're increasingly finding we're living in.
Thank you for that. I feel like there's a lot of key themes that you shared. There's awareness, self-preparation, self-awareness, and communication, essentially, that a lot of companies need to look at when they're building their teams on crisis. So Nick, going to you, because you also have a very unique perspective. So working as a senior regional security officer for the U.S. Embassy, you do have a unique view into both the diplomatic and the operational security side. From your perspective, how have regional crises evolved in the Gulf and surrounding areas? And what can the private sector learn from how diplomatic missions assess and respond to these complex risks?
Well, like Giles said, I mean, new normal, it's a term we often use in government, private sector. It's really not new anymore, right? This is the reality that we're facing, especially since October 2023 in the region. What would be considered a showstopper for operations, whether they be public or private sector? The government is flexing, just like the private industry is, in terms of adjusting how we do what we do and reinforcing our resiliency. So from Beirut to Jerusalem, a lot of our operations are consisting, we're just adjusting. In the past, when the US government may have closed a post or reduced it into some sort of a suspended or limited operations, it's still operating in a somewhat normal capacity to continue to provide services, to continue to get outside those embassy walls to try to engage and also deliver on some of our U.S. foreign policy goals. What I do want to highlight is what I mentioned before in terms of the collaboration within that interagency that I think the private sector also has in terms of some of those shared public-private partnerships. We at the State Department have a Overseas Security Advisory Council. We have a strong chapter here in UAE with a number of corporations that are here that are sharing a lot of that information in terms of how to respond to some of the complex challenges that are ahead. I will stress 3 points, and I'm talking to a large group here, who have seen this before, and I'm sure most, if not all of you, are aware of how to do what you do right and flexing. One of the things is to establish those relationships as foundations ahead of time. So you may not need that relationship, you may not need that individual now, but you may need them later. But you can certainly build off of an established relationship ahead of a crisis by doing it now versus later, in the midst of a crisis when they may be busy or they may be focused on something else. If there's some sort of a hostage crisis on an airplane at an airport, and it's the first time I'm talking to my FBI and FAA counterpart, it's probably not a good time to get a hold of them. I want to be able to have some of that interactivity, that communication, obviously, in advance. What we in the government too are learning, I think, a lot from the private sector is, using a lot of that intelligence and data-driven decision-making in terms of what we're doing. And, now trying to ingrain that approach to some of the solutions that we're doing. And that requires, not just what we're doing in the field, but also from some of our Washington headquarters, and to try to do what I mentioned before and try in terms of getting the others in Washington as far as the interagency on board in terms of their assessments and the approach to managing a crisis. And speaking of headquarters, obviously, all of us have that element that, you may be a part of or you may have to answer to. It's critical for that leader in a crisis to be proactive in communication, to get ahead of the headquarters narrative and to demonstrate that you have that process, that preparedness in place to encounter that crisis. Because if you don't get a hold of it and demonstrate that you're on firm footing, then you'll quickly lose control as far as that headquarters perspective in terms of how to manage the situation as a leader in a crisis.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I always say also that it's good to develop the relationships before you need something from someone. It goes a really long way when you're in the middle of a crisis. Thank you so much for that. So Aimee, you are working for a big, popular social media company. When misinformation or conflicting reports start circulating, whether internally or on social platforms, how do you quickly verify information and keep your team aligned without creating noise or confusion?
That's a good question. I think we're all seeing, all industry leaders here, that the operating environment, the threat environment that we're in now is becoming more interconnected, more layered. Things aren't occurring in just one of the spaces. If we see something occur in the physical space, it often manifests in the digital space. So I think firstly, to Nick's point, it's that breaking down silos, which is complicated in any company, any agency. It's really hard to do. But when we're looking at misinformation, it's more importantly so. We're trying to integrate information from all of those different spaces so that we can understand the full picture. We're leaning on our intelligence partners, on security, on communications, on cyber. So I think initially when those rumors start circulating or the misinformation starts spreading either online or potentially even within your own internal sources, the initial instinct is often to clamp down. We don't know the full picture. We're not going to communicate. We're just not going to say anything. But that delay in communicating often fuels the misinformation. It's filled with a space of speculation when you don't address them. And ultimately, that's what erodes trust in the company and indeed in crisis management. So I think acting quickly is important. I think not trying to be the loudest in the room, to the speech earlier, Don't try and shout over it. Don't try and be the loudest voice. Acknowledge that there's misinformation, correct it with facts that you've established and corroborated, and try and stay on topic. So yeah, I think that's probably the most important way that we can, we're acknowledging that there is misinformation, we're correcting it, we're staying on topic, and we're not trying to be the loudest in the room to try to drown out the noise.
Really great insights. Thank you so much. And Nigel, you work with diverse industries on security and infrastructure continuity. How can cross-sector collaboration transform crisis outcomes, and what's stopping it from happening more effectively today?
I know we're very short on time. What does it give us, the cross-collaboration? It gives us speed, it gives us efficiency, it gives us results. That bit is very obvious. The piece that's really stopping it, I think, is everybody in this room has grown up in the industry, around the industry, certainly in their companies, they've developed their networks. But in a time of leadership or in a time of crisis when you're needing to lead, it's actually not going to be about you. It's going to be about your juniors, your colleagues, and it's making sure that they've got the exposure, and you're forcing them to get the exposure to their opposite numbers in your vendors, in your clients, in the civil authorities or the military authorities, who they are going to be liaising with when that crisis actually occurs. Because it's not going to be you liaising with everybody. It's going to need to be your team that has the same exposure you've got as a leader, but you've had a 10-year head start on them.
Thank you so much. I know we ran out of time, but really, really quick, one question, maybe 30 seconds each. What's one blind spot most leaders still have when it comes to managing risk in 2025?
I would say interconnectedness. The fact that, all of these workspaces, all of these crises, they're occurring in every single one of our departments, and working in silos is just not an option anymore. Amazing.
I put a post-it on my wall as I kind of got more senior in crisis management, and it said, identify the inevitable and get there first. And I think, for me, the blind spot is waiting for the inevitable. And I think you can turn a crisis into a real opportunity if you can identify what you're going to have to do and corral the system and get there first. That's what I'd suggest.
Amazing. Nick?
Looking after your team, it's obviously something that's been mentioned before. One of my favorite African proverbs is, you can go pretty fast, but you can't go as far without the rest of your team. So looking after them and taking a pause and seeing how they're doing, looking behind you and seeing if they understand what's going on and they're behind you. That's my takeaway.
Okay.
One blind spot, so many of us, so many people in companies think about it and they talk about it a lot. The risk is the current buzzword. Very few are briefing down to their teams and their people, not necessarily in huge detail, but what is the leadership going to be doing when we get into a crisis? When that awareness is achieved, there's a lot more security within the individuals, there's a lot more knowledge, and people are more content.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So I know we ran out of time, so I want to say thank you so much for today, for sharing your experiences and your insights. I know we can talk about it all day long if we can, but they only gave us 20 minutes. So thank you so much, and thank you to the audience. Please take advantage of this amazing panel if you have questions after this session. Have a great day.